So this portion of the unit combines chapters 44 and 45, population and community ecology. I think it's one of the easier and more fun concepts in biology, but then again, my degrees were in ecology and evolution, and so I tend to focus on the fun stuff, the interesting portions. We start off learning how organisms interact with their environment, and then we talk about different types of environments in chapter 46, and then we end this class talking about conservation biology and how we can conserve and preserve those resources and those habitats, or at least whatever little bit is remaining. And so ecology itself is just the study of living things and how they interact with their physical environment. And so the physical environment could be qualities of air, it could be water quality, it could be soil composition and quality, it could be how complex the landscape is, how complex their habitat system is. There are all sorts of, UV radiation could be an aspect of ecological study. And so you're thinking about how the organism is living, how they're surviving, not just amongst other organisms, but amongst their environment. And so when we're talking about ecology, we have to have a few basic concepts out of the way so that you're not lost when we're saying things. The first is habitat. When I'm talking about habitat, that is the specific place an individual lives, a specific location on the planet where an individual, an organism is living. When we're discussing populations of organisms, that's a group of the same species. And so a population is all the same species, like a population of white-tailed deer or a population of red maple. It's the same group in that particular location. A community, however, is still in that particular location on the planet, but we're looking at all the living organisms. And so when you say the community or the complexity of a community in a given area, you're just talking about the living things, not the non-living. Now, moving up further, if we were to discuss living and non-living, we could use the phrase ecosystem. Ecosystem still kind of hones us in on a particular spot on the planet, a particular location, but it denotes that we are discussing both the living concepts and the non-living. So communities interacting with their environment in that given area. Now, as we move into chapter 46, we'll begin to discuss biomes and the whole biosphere. And so as a whole, there are all these places on the planet where things can exist in the atmosphere and the soil and the water. And this whole group, this area where living things can inhabit is called the biosphere. And so an ecologist can focus on the individual organism, or they can focus broadly on the whole entire ecosystem, because really, if you're focusing on the individual and you're trying to decide, how they interact with their environment, or if they're not doing well, what can be done to make sure they're doing better, you have to include the whole ecosystem. You can't really just focus on one thing. That doesn't really make any sense. And so even if you study only one particular type of species or only one particular population, you still have to bring in the concepts of the ecosystem. You don't have one without the other. And so we just need to understand the difference between these terms, and you'll need to be able to pick out the difference no matter how I word it on an exam. Now, in a given area, you don't just say, yep, that organism lives there, great. You would look at how dense the population is and how it is distributed. When you're talking about population density, you're discussing the number of individuals, how many there are. Now, distribution is where they are. And that seems kind of like, okay, cool, why do we care where they are? Things just live in their environment. That may be so to kind of the lay person, but when you start paying attention to organisms and where they live, a lot of things have specializations. And so we find things in a given big habitat inhabiting only small portions of that microhabitat. And so we'll discuss as we move on, we get to talking about species of birds and how they might all look like they're all just hanging out in this tree. But really, if you start learning your species names and learning the difference between those, you'll notice they only inhabit certain portions of that. Now, we also have generalists that hang out everywhere. But as an ecologist, as someone studying that area and looking at this, you need to know that habit. You need to understand where they are in that in that given ecosystem. We're also going to use the term limiting factor, which is kind of a broad term that just means anything that can sort of limit where this organism can live or how well they can do. And so there are all kinds of things that could be limiting factors. It just depends on what that species is adapted to. And so limiting factors are just environmental aspects that determine where something can live. Now, a lot of things can sort of live in the gray areas of their limiting factors, but thrive in that given habitat that they prefer. So as an example, the book gives you trout prefer to live in cool mountain streams where oxygen load is high. Doesn't mean they can't live in warmer streams where oxygen is lower, but they're going to thrive and do better in the cooler streams with higher levels of oxygen. And so the limiting factor there will be where the water is cooler, where there is more oxygen. Where your organisms like carp tend to live wherever. They can live in warmer rivers, downstream rivers, areas with lower oxygen, not quite hypoxic, but still in lower areas that you wouldn't expect. Or things like catfish that can even go without water for a given amount of time. So because this is not an ecology class, it's general biology, there are some concepts that we gloss over. With distribution, when you're looking at what organisms are, you can really sort of group it into three categories. Things can be just random, so your generalist species, wherever you find them. Things can be in a uniform pattern or in a clumped pattern, grouped together. And this is true not just for plants, but for other animals as well, but it's easier to look at with plants. And some things, their distribution patterns change as they mature. And so right now in spring, all of the trees, especially all the maples, are dropping all their little helicopter seeds, little samaras. They're dropping all of the seeds that can grow and become, mature trees. And so if you start paying attention, you'll see little trees growing absolutely everywhere in your yard. All in the front, they're growing in your gutter, they're growing absolutely everywhere, wherever that seed can land and germinate. But we know that as those little sprouts, if they're given time to grow and mature into larger trees, we don't just see trees just right next to each other. So what happens? As, let's say, this tree, as it is allowed to grow, say it gets enough water, enough sunlight, and it gets larger and larger and larger, it's going to outcompete those around it. It's going to shade out the others, it's going to pull nutrients from the soil, going to pull water from the soil. And so not every single one of these seedlings is going to make it. And eventually you see the same thing. And so if you were kind of looking at a forest, an old growth forest, from an aerial view, it would kind of look like a uniform pattern. Like someone went through and planted it, every 4 feet or whatever it is. You don't necessarily notice that from the ground, but looking down, you see that. We know that's not the case. There were just certain limiting factors affecting that distribution. And so it could be as simple as, we're talking about maples or oaks growing larger and shading out the others. Or if you look at the screen here, you see those creosote bushes. Some organisms exist in areas like this desert environment where it's already dry. You're rarely going to find water as it is. And so whatever water they have, they're going to suck together and use on their own. Some things also put out specific chemicals that sort of leach into the soil and make sure that even if a seedling was to sprout there, they couldn't possibly grow like that. Or if you're bored by plants, think about certain animals like mountain lions or cougars, right? They have that big 3-mile range or whatever, and they go through and they mark their territory all along the edge so that other males won't join into that spot, won't sort of butt up against theirs. And so if we were to map that out and look at it, it would look like there was some sort of pattern to it, a uniform pattern, but it's because there are other limiting factors that we might not be considering. Now, there are some species, like think about the, starlings or crows you see all across the parking lot. It's kind of the layperson, it kind of looks like they're just all clumped together, And so they kind of have more of a generalized habitat, but that's their survival mechanism. If we're looking at an organism and we're looking at how well they can perform, if we were to imagine that all resources were unlimited and that limiting factors were at minimum, and we were to just have a theoretical number for how fast that population can grow, that would be the biotic potential. The biotic potential is the maximum rate of increase. So if everything else was golden, if everything else was, as good as it could get for this species, how well can they reproduce? How well can they spread? How well can they thrive? That's the biotic potential. Now, because every environment out there is full of limiting factors and competition and all kinds of stuff happening, most species never reach their biotic potential. But knowing that number, knowing how fast a species can reproduce and how well they can thrive, helps you understand if a population isn't doing as well. And so the biotic potential depends on factors that influence the population's reproduction rate. And so it could be the number of offspring that survive to reproductive age. It could be amount of competition in the population. It could be number of reproductive opportunities. So even if you have all these healthy individuals, if they can never find a mate to reproduce with, they're not going to pass on offspring. So they're not going to reach their biotic potential. Now, other major factors play a role in this as well, like the amount of disease, predation. What if some random event occurs, like a flood or an earthquake or a fire? Obviously, that's going to wipe out some of that biotic potential for that time period. And so things rarely ever reach their biotic potential, but it gives you a good number to sort of rate the population against. And so if we were to have our biotic potential as a graph, if we were to say, this is how well, I don't even know, how well a species can do in a given amount of time. The most that an environment can support, the highest number of individuals that can exist in an environment without outcompeting and limiting that population is called the carrying capacity. And if you've had, we used to call it college algebra, what's it called now? Pre-calculus algebraic reasoning. And you remember your exponential growth formula. We use a variable k. K tends to stand for that carrying capacity. And so you could use that letter, that sound, the consonant k to help you remember k as carrying capacity. But that's the highest amount of number of that species that the population can support before it becomes so many they begin to negatively affect themselves. And so the closer a population is to its carrying capacity, the more likely its resources become scarce. Now, some species are always at their carrying capacity. Think about things like elephants, bears, things that are large, things that require a lot of habitat, require a lot of particular resources to survive. And so they're always pretty much hovering at their carrying capacity. Or if you imagine something like a mosquito or a weed that just needs, a mosquito just needs a couple teaspoons of water to reproduce hundreds of babies, they're never going to reach their carrying capacity. We are never going to run out of resources to support a population of mosquitoes. It's just never going to get there. And so ecologists tend to use carrying capacity to describe species. And that's something that we kind of gloss over in this chapter. But carrying capacity is an important, I don't want to say number because it's not always a particular number, like, oh, we can support 33 bear. It's not quite like that, but it is a given amount. It's kind of an average range. And so other effects such as competition and predation become extremely noticeable when a population is at that carrying capacity, because they're always bumping into each other. They're always trying to utilize that same resource. And this thing called competition plays a big role when we get into the concepts of chapter 45, things competing over the same thing. Now, in regards to this population size, how well it's doing, there are certain environmental factors that play a major role in regards to the number of species. Now, there are some things that can go through and will affect the environment or the population regardless of number of species. And so we use two terms. We say density independent factors and density dependent factors. And I think you can probably understand which one means which. But density independent means it doesn't matter how many organisms come through that given area. If we have this type of event, it's going to wipe out whatever's in the path. So a tornado or a flood. Doesn't matter how many organisms are in that area, it's going to affect them all the same. Density dependent are factors that require sort of bumping into other things, like disease. Disease can only be spread if there are enough of you to reach. Or things like predation. If a cougar is going after one deer versus a cougar going after 100 deer, you can imagine which one is easier for it to find food. And so that's a density dependent factor. Or parasitism, passing parasites from one thing to the next. If you never come across anybody else, you're never going to get that parasite that you carry. But if there are 1,000 of you in a given area, it's much more likely you're going to pass that parasite on. And so these pictures are kind of silly. I keep them in the book because I keep them in because I think they're funny. Your book uses them, but they're trying to show you, here's a low density of mice, high density of mice. If a flood comes through, it doesn't care what's in that path. It's affecting everybody the same. It's a density independent factor. As opposed to predation, that's a density dependent factor. And so the number of organisms plays a big role in how many can be eaten. And these density independent and dependent factors play a very important role in keeping populations in check in their given environment. Because these things adapted alongside one another, right? They evolved together, not on their own necessarily, for the most part, for what we're talking about right now. And so there's this complex interaction. Some things can outgrow their carrying capacity, can outgrow their specific limiting factors. A big example were the reindeer or caribou, depending on if they're domesticated or not. Did you know that reindeer and caribou are the same thing? It's just one's domesticated and one's wild, and we use two different terms. Anyway, in Alaska, tons of caribou. What do you have up in Alaska growing? If you think about the general area, it's a pretty huge area. Not much. And so these reindeer survive solely on sort of this specific type of moss. Now, for several reasons, in the early 1900s, the reindeer sort of outgrew their carrying capacity, outgrew that limit. And so when you have so many of them, they begin to outcompete each other for food. They ate so much of their food source that it was almost completely eliminated, and that population dramatically crashed. And so we see this spike and fall with populations because they kind of limit themselves. Once you get to a certain amount, too many of you in a given area, you begin to limit yourself because things like disease, predation, and competition begin to play a large role. Another big example, the book likes to use New York as an example, but I like to use our own backyard, are the white-tailed deer. White-tailed deer are prolific breeders. Their populations can grow very quickly. And so after they're born, females can begin to breed their first year, which is, you might not always consider that. They think they take time to grow and time to reach that reproductive age. But once they start breeding, they produce around, on average, 2 young each year of life. That doesn't mean every single one produces 2 young, but on average, that's what they produce. Now, a century ago, the white-tailed deer population was less than 500,000. Today, if you consider all the area of white-tailed deer, it's well over 200 million. But think about it. If you go back a century ago, early 1900s, think about how much forested area there was. A ton, right? We've fragmented and gotten rid of a lot. Plus, think about how many natural predators there were. Things that we have extremely limited. And so we don't get along with apex predators. We don't get along with bear in our backyard or cougars coming across our parks and playgrounds. And so we tend to eliminate them. And so because of those two factors, we've gotten rid of habitat, we've gotten rid of predators, but the deer keep breeding. And so they have this massive population. And so even though we've lost the natural predators, we have to make sure that in order to keep a healthy population, that we have hunting seasons so that we can go out and limit them ourselves now. Otherwise, they would completely outgrow those areas and be a detriment to the entire habitat. Because once you have diseased organisms and parasites running rampant and extreme death, it's sort of unhealthy for the whole thing. Because remember, we're talking about ecology. And so you have to remember, we're talking about the whole ecosystem. And usually if you lose or there's a problem with one main group, especially a key player in that ecosystem, the whole habitat suffers. And so we have to make sure to have those given areas. Now, we don't want to wipe them out completely. And so we have those seasons to make sure that we're not just out there hunting all the time and wiping them out like we have done several other organisms. The book likes to use Long Island, New York as an example because they banned hunting for a while, obviously, as the city was growing. This is a century ago. And so as that happened, the population completely outgrew what it could handle and disease ran rampant. But we kind of see that in our own backyard. And so an issue we have right now is chronic wasting disease, which is not a virus. It's not a bacteria. It's a misfolded protein, which we call a prion. Now, we have no cure for prions. Have you heard of mad cow disease or bovine spongiform encephalitis? It can cross to humans. It's a terrible thing. It's in the spinal column. If you eat it or if other cows eat it, the sheep can get it, cows can get it. It's a prion. It basically causes your proteins in your brain to misfold and your brain to get inflamed and you die. But prions can lay latent in your body for 30 years and you don't know about it. So the scary thing right now with chronic wasting disease is if we don't limit these populations of deer, it's going to quickly spread between them because they get it from eating dirt near each other, eating things near each other. So they have those testing sites up. So if you bring in your harvest, you say, here's the skull, take the brain, see if it has chronic wasting disease. And so even though there is no known transfer between human and deer right now, these prions can lay latent for decades. And nobody wants to be the first person to come down with chronic wasting disease because as of now, we have no cure. And so that's why we're being so strict and trying to pay attention and trying to limit these populations by encouraging hunting and getting people out there to limit these populations so that we don't have this type of disease. And so in a lot of times, hunting like that can be a great thing to help balance that population. Because we're not going to go back out. We're not going to release hundreds of cougars. We're not going to, encourage, wolves suddenly to come back into our backyard, even if that would be the healthiest way to maintain it. And so we kind of have to do what we can. Does anybody eat deer? Do you like deer? I almost ate it exclusively for a long time. I loved it. I think it tastes delicious. I get a little worried sometimes, probably a little too paranoid, because sometimes when you take your deer, if you don't process it yourself, you take it to a processing facility, depending on who's doing it, sometimes you don't get back your deer, you just get back a certain weight. And so if someone wasn't careful when they were harvesting a particular deer, if you don't know what you're doing really, and you cut into the spinal column or you get bits of brain or whatever, there's always the risk that could be in the meat and that could be passed on. And that's why they're being so serious about having tests in certain counties to find out is chronic wasting disease there, because you don't want to risk being that person that comes down with it. My luck, it's going to be me because I'm so paranoid about it. Oh well. That will be your claim to fame. You can say that you knew the person that was the first person to come down with chronic wasting disease. Are we okay with those concepts so far? I don't want to say it's simple because I understand that everything is different for each person. But to me, this chapter is a little bit easier. It's definition based, and we're really just thinking about how well a population is doing or how poorly it's doing. So you can kind of use those to help you the whole time. We're going to move now into more of the chapter 45 concepts. Do we have time? Yeah. Into the chapter 45 concepts, which is talking less about the individual populations and more about the community as a whole. So living organisms as a whole. And so when you're discussing the assemblies of these populations interacting with one another, we're still talking about in the same environment. So we're still in a particular location. That's important. When you're talking about population or community, you're saying in a particular location, even if you don't always say it. And there are two ways we can describe a community. And these words sound very similar. So you have to be able to separate them. One is species richness, and one is species diversity. Richness is the composition of your community. So it's essentially a list of the species. So we have red maple, white maple, we have black willow, we have white-tailed deer, we have squirrel, we have cardinal. You know, you're listing all the species that you're concerned about. But with species richness, it doesn't say anything about number. And so if we had one red maple, one cardinal, one squirrel, one white-tailed deer, one black oak, right? If we went through and listed, it would seem like richness would mean we have a pretty healthy ecosystem. But if a system is not diverse, richness doesn't mean anything. Richness is good to monitor so you know what you have, but it's diversity that is extremely important. Diversity is abundance, and you always want a system to be diverse. Because why? Because these systems adapted alongside one another. These systems grew before we even thought about having a hand in it. And so oftentimes if systems are diverse, it will maintain itself. And all we have to do is make sure that we're not doing something terrible. And so if you maintain a high species diversity, the health of the habitat will maintain itself. It will stay healthy. And so diversity is both the richness, the number, and the listing of those species. And so you can kind of just tell yourself diversity equals good, which is really true in all aspects of our life. Diversity is always a good thing.